Welcome to the Regenerative Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have Jacob Muise, who is a co-founder and the CEO of Maui Nui Venison. Maui Nui Venison is supporting regenerative agriculture with its lineup of venison products made from wild harvesting the invasive axis deer population on the island of Maui. Maui Nui Venison is the most nutrient-rich and protein-dense red meat on the planet. Their stress-free wild harvesting methods ethically and responsibly manage the invasive axis deer population of Maui in an effort to restore ecological balance to the island. In this episode, we learned how Jake went from surfing the frosty waters off of Nova Scotia to the warm waters of Hawaii, the ecological imperative for managing the axis deer population in Hawaii, and how Jake turned his obsession for axis deer into the powerhouse brand that Maui Nui is today. Now look, this is a little outside of the box application of the term regenerative agriculture, and that may not fly for some of you purists out there, but guess what? We don't really care, because Maui Nui's outcomes in terms of ecological benefit, human nutrition, and community benefit are unquestionably regenerative. And this is the first of 2 episodes in a row where we feature a brand with a nuanced take on regen somewhat outside of the norm. And the word on the street is there are multiple top secret reveals buried deep in this episode. So I think you'll want to listen until the very end. Let's ride. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. Very excited today to have our friend Jake from Maui Nui Venison with us. So welcome, Jake.
Oh, pleasure to be here, guys.
We're super stoked, and I don't want to dismiss anybody else. Like, we're stoked to talk to all the regenerative brands, but AC and I are both like super stoked to talk to you for a variety of reasons that we're going to get into. But before I steal any thunder, Jake, give us a quick lay of the land. Like, for those who are unfamiliar with Maui Nui, what do you produce or make, and where can people find your products today?
We harvest invasive axis deer on the island of Maui. We turn that into food for customers and community that you can find here locally, but also direct to consumer via the website at mauinuivenison.com.
Awesome. Before we get too far into the origin story, if you had to choose one Maui Nui product that you say was your favorite, or for somebody to try for the first time, what would that product be?
Our peppered venison stick is like, it's one of those things that I just had this conversation with our team this morning. Is like, I think it's going to be our Oreo cookie. Like, it's something that's going to live for the next 30 years, that you're never going to have to change the flavor. Like, it's just something that you can eat nonstop. So yeah, it'd be that peppered stick for sure.
Jay, I got to push back. I don't want to start with a fight, but number one, I love the peppered stick. I think it's fantastic. But I think the original, with just like that 2 grams of sugar, is like so well balanced. I actually just had 2 of my buddies up, and I was like, "You guys have to try this meat stick." And I had them try the peppered first, and they're like, "Wow, this is really good." And then I had them try the original, and they're like, "Holy shit, this is amazing." So just that's only 3 people's opinions, but I think the original is really it's the way to go for me.
Yeah, you start with those sticks either way. It's the greatest. Like, venison, are you sure? And then like you hand them a stick, and they're like, "Oh, wait a second, like, yeah, I can do this." Yeah.
The products are phenomenal, and if anyone hasn't tried them, we definitely recommend that. I got a sampler box not too long ago for the first time, and I was like, "Wow, this is very legit." And I'm actually in due for a reorder, so I got to take care of that after we get done with this recording. But Jake, this is a unique first for us, because it's, I would say, atypical regen or beyond regen, or it's a little bit outside of your typical production agriculture mandate. But I think when we think about the principles of regeneration and the outcomes we're seeking, it's very much aligned and accomplishing that, and maybe even going beyond that, depending on your opinion. So super excited to kind of give folks a peek behind the curtain of that, from a brand perspective, but also from like how the hell did you build a business out of, harvesting these animals that are not easy to harvest and have a ton of complexity around them. But you're not native to Hawaii. You have a really cool kind of personal journey coming there. There's a very interesting backstory to the axis deer population in Hawaii. There's the story of the brand. So I don't even know where to start, but maybe start with kind of how you got there and how you got acquainted with this problem, so to speak, locally.
Yeah, happy to. Very long story short, was lucky enough to get asked to play Division I sports at the University of Hawaii, but grew up in a subsistence hunting family in northern Canada and also on like the east coast of Nova Scotia. Learned to surf on the east coast of Nova Scotia in like the early 90s when nobody was doing it. We were like buying old.
When wetsuit technology was not what it is today.
Yeah. What water temps are we talking here?
You're talking like, I remember on every winter, like it's slushing over in the bays.
Oh my God.
Like,
That's insane.
Yeah. And I remember like my dad's rule was when you couldn't feel your fingers and toes, like you had to get out. Like i.e. early onset hypothermia, like you should get out. Like, not how I'd recommend it for my kids these days. But anyway, to their credit, I went on my recruiting trip to Hawaii and they handed me my first like real pair of board shorts. And when you're from Canada, like everything still had the old school lining in it. I remember like grabbing that. You guys remember that old lining, right?
Oh yeah.
Remember like
weird white fishnet stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember grabbing the pair of shorts and being like, "Where's the liner?" Like I was so confused. Like I had no idea what to do with like this pair of shorts that had no liner. So anyway, no liner, no wetsuit, and the first thing they did is like, because they knew I was a surfer, they took me like straight to Alamana Bowls, which is like right in front of the university, and I was like, and where do I sign? Like, what do you guys want me to do here? But other great accident that happened is they accidentally screwed up my dorm assignment, and they put me in the dorm with all of the Hawaiian kids that didn't have good enough grades that had to come to summer school from Molokai, from this small island. Wow. So it was like this very amazing group of guys and girls. And I was like, I call myself a muggle, but like, I was like the one white guy stuck in this like giant brown dormitory. Nothing, like scared shitless for the first 10 minutes. Nothing better in my whole life could have happened to me. That true saying of like aloha spirit, like it lives, it's real. They're just like, well, if you're here, we're going to take care of you. And they just like, they took such extraordinary care of me, including at that point, my family was on the east coast of Canada in Nova Scotia. So it was way too far to travel for like, anything, Christmas or anything. So that my roommate in that family adopted me. They hanai'd me. And so I started going over to Molokai, which I didn't know, but had a established herd of axis deer, and growing up in a subsistence community. You guys have probably heard this, like Canadians are nice folks and they're pretty polite, and they're like, at least some of them. Small island Molokai felt a lot like home, i.e. everybody was like eating something they hunted or fished, that community shared. There wasn't anybody hungry. Everybody was polite. Everybody waved at each other. So like, I was so fortunate to get a home away from home. And that was my original understanding of deer from like a recreational subsistence level. And then it just grew in understanding the more I was there and the more I learned, for sure.
Quick question, like how did the deer get to the islands in the first place?
Okay, great question. So islands, so there's three islands in Hawaii right now that have deer on them: Molokai, Lanai, and Maui. So we only operate on Maui. But in 1868, 2 bucks and 5 does were brought in for Kamehameha V, and they like, my wife translates Hawaiian newspaper, so she's able to collect all this amazing information. They came down the Ganges River on India, like via India. The boat was named like the Loch Nagar, like they have all of it. But like, long story short, they went to Molokai. And then a kapu. So a kapu is a restriction. It's a Hawaiian name for like a restriction. A kapu was placed on them. And so this is 1868. And as early as 1909, just to give you guys some context, as early as 1909, they brought in, no, as early as 1898, they brought in California shooters and they shot 7,000 deer in a few months. In 1898.
So 30 years.
Right.
So in 30 years, they went from
Holy
like
cow.
7 deer to there being like a substantial problem. Because I remember cool, my wife showing me newspapers from like I think it was like 1894. There were already newspaper articles citing like locals being concerned about the deer filling the forests and like decimating them. So like, so deer get Molokai, or Molokai get deer in the late 1800s. They rapidly expand. Fun fact. Axis deer are one of the few deer species in the world that can breed year round. When an elk, mule deer, when they cast their antler, when that antler falls off every year, their testosterone levels drop low enough that their sperm isn't viable. That's why you have these really pronounced rut periods for elk and these other animals. So axis deer, even after they drop their antlers, testosterone levels stay high enough that sperm is viable year round, i.e. they can, anytime a doe goes into estrus, they're able to like breed and impregnate that doe. So that's why you see such prolific growth rates. A kind of great segue there is, well, deer go to Lanai, another small island in the 1920s, quickly reach, kind of the maximum number there as well too. But in 1959, 1960, the Territorial Board of Ag, essentially after a very long back and forth, they introduced them to Maui, guaranteeing that they won't get out of control. Yeah, right. But to bring you guys back to the difference, at the same time, black-tailed deer were introduced to Kauai, which is another island, and you can still barely find a black-tailed deer.
Wow.
So it's species, like the problem, a lot of what we'll talk about today is like very, very unique in scenario situation, like species. This is a very unique scenario because of the species. So yeah, long story short there, late 1800s on the Molokai, 1920s they're on Lanai, and then 1959, 1960 they come to Maui. And from the 60s till now, even though, we've harvested 50,000 plus animals, already, there's currently about 70,000, but maximum capacity on Maui is looking like 210 to 220,000 animals on only like 465,000 acres.
Right. So,
very unique species in a very unique place that is resulting in unique problem, but ultimately product as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, and you touched on basically the males and the females can mate much more than a typical deer. And I think I've heard you say on other podcasts and in other places, there's no natural predators in Hawaii.
Yep.
And this breed of deer also developed in the jungles of India, getting away from, big jungle felines and places like that, things like that, that it's much more harder to kill, so to speak, right? It's like those three big things contribute to resiliency.
Hard to kill, but also much more adaptable. So if as the population was growing here, what they do so well is they find safe places. And if there's enough food and water in that safe place, they just stay. They won't range if they don't need to. So they're highly, highly adaptable, not having developed like migratory traits like a mule deer moving from like the mountain to the flat. So if it's like, I've got food, I've got water, I feel safe here, they'll stay. And then they find these safe places, they're able to grow until essentially like they've eaten themselves out of house and home and they have to like move out into these other areas. So highly adaptable, which is part of the issue as well.
That all makes sense. And this is so interesting to hear all this backstory. I didn't have all these details before, and it almost feels like fate. You happen to grow up on the east coast of Canada, happen to be one of, I would assume, very few surfers at that time, happen to move to Hawaii, and there happens to be this invasive deer species, and you are a hunter from Canada, right?
Yeah.
So now that we have all of this context, like when did this axis deer population? You mentioned your first exposure in college. Going to some of the your classmates' families, places and learning about their subsistence relationship with the fish and the deer and like that. When was this first kind of put on your radar in some sort of a capacity? It was like, this is a problem that we actually need to solve for, and you want to get involved and try to do something to help.
Yeah. So lucky that the introduction was through the lens of value, or like them being an asset to community, because it really has dictated a lot of our management strategies. But for the first several years, it was only like, for me personally and for that family, like it was valuable to community. And then I think it was my third or fourth year of college, we were going back, as we always did, to like fill up the small little dorm freezer so you didn't have to eat the cafeteria food. And Molokai had been through a period of pronounced drought, and we went to like our regular hunting area. Come around the corner, I could see them from like 150 yards away, like in their usual spot, and I'm like, oh, awesome, they're there. And then as we're getting closer and they're not moving, I'm just like, oh, this is going to be great. And then all of a sudden started to recognize like a lot less general movement in the herd, and I was like, what is happening? And I can like remember this, like I have like a picture perfect memory of this. And then got this odd sense that something was wrong, and realized after walking closer that there was about 150, 200 animals that were basically laying down, dying of starvation and malnutrition.
Wow.
So there's this like crazy realization. I still can remember it and feel it. I'll be like, what? Like, I couldn't harvest one. They weren't going to be healthy enough to eat. There wasn't even like hardly any meat on them. And then B, I remember being with Makana, like my best friend, and being like, this is how it works. And he's like, yeah, this is what happens every 10 or 15 years. They'll produce so many offspring, population will boom, and the only thing that like can reset that is like they don't have enough to eat, right? And that gets more pronounced with drought. And that was just like this gut-wrenching realization for me that I'm like, this cannot be how we're treating a resource that is so valuable to community. Like this can't be the default management mechanism. And that was that entrepreneurial trigger for me, where like I remember coming home from that trip and just starting to like read everything I could, figure everything. Like it went from a food relationship to like a full-blown obsession with species instantly, to like how are we gonna like do this? And this is 2003. This is 20 years ago.
Didn't you like start the Axis Deer Institute so people would actually give you information because they knew it before you did that?
So a rational obsession turned into like whole lifestyle, i.e. my capstone class in college, wrote a massive business plan mimicking the New Zealand model of like domestication, habituation. But as I was trying to collect species information, the only information was out of India and nobody would answer me. So literally overnight, I just like, made a fake logo, made myself executive director, put the logo on the bottom line. And the very first email I sent, they're like, oh, it's amazing. Somebody's working on this issue in Hawaii. I'm like, yes. Like, but like that was before PubMed and everything else, right? So instantly had access to tons of species specific information to help make some I wasn't even able to make the decisions at that point. And turns out won the business plan competition through the capstone class, was completely wrong. The like domestication and habituation of Axis deer is like literally impossible at scale. They're one of the few deer species. You can get them like 5th generation bottle fed. I've tried. You can get them 5th generation bottle fed, and if you get them in a herd of more than 6 or 7, they will like instantly revert back to like wild, unhabituated behavior. And that's not the case for elk and red deer and a bunch of other ones. So, irrational obsession 20 years ago turned into lots of work around it.
Tactical question on like the overgrazing or overeating issue. Like, what do they eat? They eat any green plant. They eat, grasses and weeds and tree. Like, what are they eating?
Primarily grasses. Yeah, so primarily grasses to about 90%. They can survive essentially on anything. Really cool. We've done 2 satellite telemetry video collar studies where you get a collar on them with video, so you can watch what they eat. And then we have rumen samples essentially every night because we process tripe. Like we're looking in there every night to see what they're eating. So it's primarily grasses. But what's really interesting is they're fringe grazers. So they'll take a pasture and they will gradually transition that pasture from grass into like weeds or invasive tree species because they're eating the edge of the pastures down so hard that they're allowing seed banks of invasives to like pop up. But they certainly do better than other species, i.e. they'll eat anything, but their preference is for sure grass. And this will point to like nutrient density later, but they will hop a 6-8 foot fence to eat grass or a legume or something on the other side because like that's what they want to eat. They are also because of the abundance of food on these islands, they get to be very selective when there's a lot of feed. So they're highly intelligent grazers, but can survive on anything essentially.
Incredible. I want to revert back to that picture perfect moment you had, or I guess not picture perfect, picture imperfect, that memory you shared so eloquently. And what I love most about it is you are going to hunt these animals, and it is empathy for the herd that is sparking your desire to want to make a change. I just felt like that was pretty unique and really appreciate that story. I'm going to try to figure out how we fast forward through this portion because there's got to be a ton of meat. And I don't mean no pun intended, right?
Yeah.
But like, how do you go from this concept of like, okay, we need to figure out how we cull the herd strategically to essentially introduce a mock predator to control the population, and you need to turn that into a business. Venison is not necessarily like a commercially, I don't want to say viable, but it's not a commercially accepted meat, right? It's not beef, it's not pork, it's not chicken. So how do you go from like, okay, I need to do this to creating a business that actually works and works as well as you've managed to make Maui Nui work?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to give you guys the like really quick here. So Axis Deer Institute allowed us to be the perceived expert.
Yeah.
4 deer get introduced to the Big Island, which we talked about earlier, don't have any deer. Huge invasive species issues. We were the perceived expert at the time. So we got the contract to find and remove them in 100,000 square mile area. We had no idea where they were. So we hunted. It was a 3-year project. We hunted every day but Sunday. It took us 7 months to find the first one. And the awesome story, but the long story short there is there are very, very few invasive species projects in Hawaii because everything here proliferates so well that are actually successful. But in a 3.5-year period, we found and removed all of them, in the process developing still the best mammal survey technology that we know of. And the combination of that success and that technology and system allowed us to continue to be the expert. And then we got an invitation from somebody on Maui that said like, hey, if you can do that, you can come over here and just shoot these things for us. And I had been doing research on how to turn them into food, and the densities on Maui were high enough that like that was an opportunity. And walking into that very first meeting with that rancher, that they were calling them spotted rats. But remember, I started from a place of value, right? Yeah. So that was the 14 years ago. That was the start of turning it into food. Was like we were on Maui after establishing ourselves as the expert. We had a contract that was like large enough to like harvest enough deer, and that was the first phone call to the USDA. Be like, hey, I have an opportunity to do this. Can we? There was a lot of phone calls after that.
There's a lot of questions.
What was the USDA's first response? Like, dude, what do you? No way. Like, what was that first response like?
That's exactly what the response was. They were like, no. They're like, here's all the FSIS rules. Like, do your research. You can't do it, etc. Like, it was no. And there had been established rules for ante-mortem inspection, i.e. like the process of rendering. You guys probably recognize this with like buffalo, bison, elk. Like there was USDA rules for the field harvesting of a species, i.e. they're like outside in a pen, like that had existed. But what we were asked them to do at night with forward-looking infrared without penning them, like that whole process, they were just like, that's not happening.
Before we go too much further, let the viewers who are not as well versed in, some of the USDA regulations, like why is it so hard to commercially sell a wild animal?
Great. Okay, so two big things there. One, legally, in almost every state, that animal belongs to the public, i.e. it is held in public trust, like an elk in Montana, like that belongs to the public, managed by the state. It is illegal to commercially harvest that, or like you're not allowed to sell that animal for meat, right? In Hawaii, which the only native mammals are, like the biggest native mammal is like a bat this big. In Hawaii, an invasive species, an invasive mammal on private property is the ownership and liability of the landowner. So that's like the mechanism number one of like why this is possible. The mechanism number two is the USDA has the rules in place for field antemortem, or like field harvesting, but we had to show them we could follow all of the rules that usually happen like in a pen, i.e. being able to view that animal prior to harvesting, making sure it's not injured, it's potentially safe to eat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like this giant book that is the FSAS, like Meat Inspection Act. We had to show them we could do all of those things in the field at night without penning that animal. So when you call them and you say like, we can do this, yeah, they say, and more importantly, what they were most concerned with is the rendering rate, i.e. when an animal is killed in a facility, that typically looks like, I'm sure you guys have been in a meat facility, like they're coming into a meat facility through a chute system, typically into a press, their head is stuck, and the expectation in a building with that animal fully held down is like a 99% rendering efficiency. So we had to meet that same rendering.
For people that don't know what that means killing the animal, usually shooting it in the head. And that being effective 99% of the time from a humane perspective.
Yeah, so the USDA antemortem process, like their primary responsibility is to make sure that animal is killed humanely. And so when we said we think we can do that in the field, they were just like, no, you can't.
Because there's also another shot clock to get the animal back and actually process it, right? Once it's been
this could be like a 2-hour episode on how like integrating what we do, and really. So, long story short, we finally got somebody at the USDA to be like, you know what, I'll come. Fine, if it doesn't work, you're going away, right? This is after like years of phone calls, not months, years. And like I still remember like his face in the morning when the sun came up. He was just like, what did I just see? Because we had been practicing. We had been practicing nonstop, and we originally started with pet food because pet food doesn't require USDA inspection. So we were able to hone all of our skills around pet food and donations to community. And by the time he came, we were ready. And then he was like, yep. And to your guys' credit, the next step, i.e. like the processing stage, he's like, so you can accomplish antemortem, but in order to process, you're going to need a facility like right here. How are you going to do that? Right. And I had already started designing, because we had already processed thousands of animals in the field via this funky system we had for pet food. So I had already designed like a custom mobile slaughter facility, but I needed USDA approval to start, and I needed my wife's approval to remortgage our house.
And she was waiting on USDA before she gave you that approval. That was the domino for her.
I remember like the guy coming out that night, and I remember calling her before and being like, "Hey, tonight's the night," and she was like, "I don't know if like I want this to go through or not." Like, like she was just joking, like, but she knew that inflection point for risk was like at that point then exponential, because she knew the way I like once somebody gave me the yes, I was gone. Like, we had always talked about it and designed. We were never in this to like harvest a few thousand deer. We wanted to harvest enough deer to balance populations, which means we had to go from 0 to 15,000 a year as fast as possible. And that, that scared the shit out of her. So, anyway,
what year was that big inflection point, Jake? What year was that?
That was 7 years ago when they gave us. So okay. 6.5, 7 years ago. And then, so this is the other intricacy of the USDA that's really important to understand. We fall under a category called voluntary inspection. So mandatory inspection is beef, pork, chicken. Right. If a processor is going to inspect that, like for consumption, like human consumption, it's mandatory that they have the USDA or state inspection there. And it's mandatory the USDA shows up. So guess what voluntary means? We are voluntarily requesting them to be there, which A means we have to pay. In a mandatory plant, all of that is paid for by our wonderful taxpayers. And B, they can voluntarily show up. So when he was like, great, I was like, perfect. When the mobile slaughter gets here, I want 20 inspections. He's like, you can have 2. And the next month, I was like, I want 20 inspections. He's like, you can have 1. Right. And so on for...
And everything that they didn't inspect, you couldn't sell for human consumption, basically.
Nope.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
And when you say inspection and it's 1, is that 1 animal? Is that 1 night of hunting? Is that 3 animals? What does that mean?
So that's 1 night of hunting, and originally they were only giving us a 3-hour window. So we could get, 17 to 20 animals kind of max. And we were still really developing our harvesting systems. But what you're requesting for is the USDA anti-mortem inspector to be on site with you. He has to see every single animal prior to, during the shot, and after. And get this, the frontline supervisor, i.e. the USDA veterinarian for the circuit, also has to look at every single animal. This exists in no other meat facility. So not only does we need an inspector there full time that we pay for at night during federal overtime fees, then for 3 years we had to fly in the frontline supervisor from another island. We used to, I don't know if I can say this. I can say this. We used to sleep in the chill with the deer in the field because the guy couldn't get there till noon and we had been working all night.
Yeah. Wow. Crazy.
So we require 2 full-time USDA inspectors. And another long story short is after 3 to 4 years of this, they basically were like, oh, he's definitely not going away. They had to change the entire USDA circuit to place the frontline supervisor on Maui because we needed him every day. When he just has to pop into a plant like once a year. So this is the guy, when he rolls into your USDA plant, everybody's just like, oh my God, he's here. Or she's here. Like, everything has to be perfect. He lives with us. So the level of oversight for the production of venison is just next level. It doesn't exist anywhere else.
The craziest part is the harvesting part to me, because what we're talking about here is a group of snipers on ATVs with thermal goggles on in the middle of the night, and the USDA guy or gal's got a pair of thermal goggles and has to approve the shot of the deer as it is, put down, basically.
Yeah.
It's a sniper shot from however long away. Like, that's nuts.
Yeah, and if you get it wrong, they shut you down.
Yeah.
So so all the overhead for your business stops instantly, right? And that's another really long story, but and we continually improve those harvest systems. They really are systems. Like, I love to build these systems because they're highly intricate in everything down to like the way we're tagging ears after we harvest them. Like, everything comes down to minutes because from the time that animal is shot or rendered, it has to be in a chill without a hair on it in an hour. So
Wow.
so last night we did so again, think about the widgets.
Yeah.
So we did 73 last night. So at 12 o'clock we were rolling out. We didn't have any idea where they were. We didn't know what was drones were starting to fly. We're starting to collect information. And in 6 hours, you take 73 deer. I think the farthest we went was about 5 miles from last night. So, hey, you're going really fast. 73 deer found, harvested properly, carried. You can't like drag them because it'll bruise the meat and the USDA will make you trim all of them. Carried, transported back, processed, trimmed without a hair on it and like a USDA stamp on it in 6 hours.
And all at night. And so when you're saying, yeah, carry, this is like dudes, guys and gals with headlamps with the deer on their shoulders, like rucking through the steep slopes of Maui at night.
Yeah, like Maui goes from 0 to 13,000 feet of elevation in a couple miles. Like everything is on a 45-degree slope.
Jake, why don't you pick a harder business, man? Why don't you pick something harder to do?
It would be fun, my friend. This is like, I heard this quote. I can't. Somebody said it. I don't know who to attribute it to. It's like, don't be the best, be the only. Like,
hell yeah,
this is so fun. Like and admittedly, like I get just as jacked talking about ecom. Like, you go from a raw material that runs away from you to solving for the very particular taste profile of venison. Like, this is not an easy thing to actually sell.
Right.
It's been really, really fun to develop systems across like the company to try and solve for this like very, very unique problem. So, okay, big recap. We figure out USDA. That we don't go away enough so that like about 3.5 years ago, they finally place the number of employees required for us to be here to like finally scale. That's like 10, 12 years later. That's like the classic entrepreneurial, like, if you would have known, like the night after I called my wife and like, we got it, we're remortgaging the house. Like, I thought the next night we were going, like, we're there. 7
USDA
years
didn't get that memo, brother.
Yeah. And now, again, USDA are our best friend. They're like our auditing tool to make sure food is safe. We got nothing but great things to say about those guys. But about 3 years ago, all of those hurdles finally got out of the way. We were still able to take some of the most accurate surveys on the planet. So we were always keeping track of growth and an understanding. And we knew, we got to do 15,000 deer a year. We were currently doing about 1,200 to 1,500.
Wow.
So
10x.
We had to 10x it in under 3 years.
Jake, can you share the methodology around that surveying and how you came to that number? And then also, can you share what happens if the population is not controlled? Like, what is happening to the environment? What's the environmental impact of actually doing this work?
Great. So we have the very best forward-looking infrared technology in the world. Same stuff the military is using. We, from a helicopter and now from drone systems, you basically count vertically from about 1,000 feet with a certain amount of overlap. But the technology is so good. Like, I'm looking across to West Maui right now, which is like 8 miles on a vertical line. Like, I can tell you the difference between a deer and a goat at 8 miles. So,
wow.
1,000 at 1,000 feet in the air, looking straight down to reduce vertical layering of like plant and vegetation. And we've done lots of these in like kind of closed loop environments. We know to within 95, 96% the exact number of deer that are there. We've surveyed for rabbits, like everything. Like, we can essentially find anything. So that gives us really good data to start with, i.e. this is how many we have. This is how it's impacting management. We're going to be able to do that with drones pretty quickly here. So you can manage, you have data, which is like the most important part. And we via the irrational obsession for axis deer, I understood species dynamics really well. So it's actually pretty easy. Like, you put 33% into a simple interest calculator, and like that's the line. Because we've taken a ton of data over the years on pregnancies, lactation, uteral scarring. Like we know our species really, really well. So we knew we could actually predict growth rates. And then kind of the last part of your question, like what happens if you don't do it? So 220,000 deer on only 465,000 acres is like literally an ecological disaster when they, when they're consuming 7.5 pounds of dry feed a day. So we like to think of it locally we call it like Mauka to Makai. So like mountain to ocean. So there's lots of like small things, but I'll give you guys the big ones. Number one,
please.
We're the most isolated landmass on the planet. Water is our most valuable asset, period, end of story. Deer in our watersheds, i.e. in our high elevation, 7 to 12,000 feet, which were designed to capture cloud. That whole forest is like a giant beard. Like it's able to just like soak in cloud and like move them down into our aquifer. Deer decimate that understory and will affect recharge by 50%. i.e. our forest will capture 50% less water with an established deer population, because as it's caught and run down, that lower band of vegetation doesn't capture it and put it down into the ground. It'll run off. Okay. Wow. We already talked about. It's only a couple.
Jake, I just did like back of the napkin calculations. You mentioned 210,000 deer, 7.5 pounds a day. That's 575 million pounds of forage consumed a year. Just to put that number into perspective, that's absolutely insane. So sorry for the interruption, but continue on.
Yeah. And that's not just grass in our native forest. That's some of the most endangered species plant species on the planet, right? And they kind of just laugh at fencing these days. They just jump over them. They can do it. Anyway, so affecting our most valuable asset in Hawaii, which is water. So that's like first and foremost. Doesn't what happens in the world in the next 100 years. If Hawaii doesn't have water, we're in a lot of trouble. So you come downslope to what I think of as our food system. So from 7,000 to like shoreline, this is where all of like our food is grown. This is all of our roadways. This is all of our people. So obviously like deer on roadways is a pretty obvious like bad, but more importantly, what they do is and this can go really deep, but I'll give you just the basics. They compete with dry feed for our ranchers, who a lot of them are trying to move to regenerative, which is awesome. Those ranchers are the only reason Hawaii looks the way it does. Those ranchers are the only reason these marginal ag lands haven't turned into like gentlemen's $1 million estates crawling up the hill, because they've been able to like maintain these beautiful open spaces. So like that's big one, number one for community. Number two, and this is regen specific, soil. Those deer have these tiny little lips, unlike a cow, and they'll eat that thing straight down to the dirt and they pull it out. Those last ones they'll pull out and root. So they will denude an entire landscape. These are volcanic soils that they take thousands of years to make the soils, hundreds of thousands of years. And you get these rain events, which are more unstable than ever. And guess where all of that soil goes?
It's going down.
Straight into the ocean.
Yeah, it's a 45-degree slope. Like a few months ago, we had this huge rain event, and they were pulling out dump trucks of soil from parking lots. And they're trying to decide, like, what do we, like, this is the most valuable thing we have. Like, do we take it back up the hill and spread it out? So really impacting soils when there are far too many, like, in an area. And then past that shoreline is our nearshore fisheries and reefs. And there's two really big ones. One, for community, that is, they call it their ice box, but like that, all of that fish is food. Those nearshore fisheries in that level of abundance is so valuable to community in the long run as a food resource. And that sediment and soil will cover the reefs, choking them out. And you kill the reef, and then the fish are no longer able to exist there. But two, which is really interesting, is what do people pay for when they come to Hawaii? they pay for that beautiful blue water sitting in front of their hotel. And when that beautiful blue water is mud red and like you're unable to even like swim in it, the collective loss to community as a function of like economics, ecology, and there's a lot more layers into this as well. But when you think of it from mountain to ocean, like even just that, if you were trying to put like a dollar figure on what is the loss, it's millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. So that's the potential for what happens if we are out of balance, right?
I super appreciate that breakdown, and it really helps to understand like why it's so important to maintain the herd. I want to ask, the first time I heard about Maui Nui was probably between 2012 and 2014 on the Tim Ferriss podcast. And when I first heard about it, and I think it was just like an ad, it wasn't your podcast interview with him. It was like him just talking about Maui Nui. I was like, this is a really killer concept, but what happens when all the deer are gone? Like where does the business go? So help us to understand, with all the potential downsides in having too many deer on the island, why maintain herd in the right capacity? What's the benefit of having them on the island?
Yeah. When you have great data and you understand and that data and i.e. that think of it as inventory, like if it exists in our food system, this is like the fun part, because of the unique type of species they are and how unique Maui and our soil structures are, this is the most nutrient dense red meat we know of. And it's not even close. Like we're talking like 50% more like protein and amino acids, 64 times the healthy fats. Like it's not even close. So when you're saying, so if you can manage their populations responsibly, you're defaulting as any rancher is just a grass farmer. You're saying like, well, what's the most valuable thing for community and customer to have in this place? That's access deer. So we didn't know that originally. The original premise was like, let's just find balance and turn it into food. As we've discovered how nutrient dense they are, how incredible they are for like our customers and community, it is then up to the rancher and that private landowner to decide like, hey, how many deer do I want? What's the interaction between this and my cattle operation and recreational hunting and community? And the default is like, oh no, we want some of them, just not too many that they're like impacting soil and nearshore fisheries. And what's really cool is we are capable of doing that. We are capable of like maintaining the right population in areas, and that's highly dynamic. Like that's going to change all the time, but they are valuable to community and customer and the ranchers themselves. So it's finding balance, which is going to be a balancing act to do so.
The weaving of the masculine and the feminine in the brand and in your articulation of it is really cool, Jay, because you have like these really potent data and insights and kind of scientific rigor behind it. And you have this like really cool honoring of place, culture, community involvement, like value systems, indigenous wisdom. So it's just really cool. And I think it like perfectly encapsulates like the future regenerative vision that we're all trying to create in our own little ways. I guess the next question is like, how the hell did you start selling all this deer meat, man? Like what, you get the harvesting kind of up and running, and then you're like, okay, we got to sell this to somebody. What has that commercial journey been like?
What's a good place to start here? I have an investor that was in the meat industry for 40, 50 years. And he said, you accidentally created the perfect meat triangle. And I didn't know what he was talking about. And he said, it's the only perfect, he said, it's the only, like the meat triangle is something the biggest meat companies in the world spend millions, billions of dollars on. And it's breed, feed, and humane handling. Yeah. And he said, those three parts of the triangle create the perfect product. And if you mess up any one of those, it's what creates product inconsistency. And he's like, you didn't know what you're doing, but you accidentally have a single breed that goes and finds itself perfect feed. And we have like our harvesting systems essentially introduce no stress to that animal, like during the process. And to answer your question of like, how did you start selling it? we got really lucky in that the accidental triangle that we produced creates a highly consistent product. Now, that was not always the case. Like when we were just doing the first few thousand a year, and we only had like our one little slaughter facility, we would take whole carcass, ship it to another island for processing. Very quickly, that was too much for them, and we didn't have there wasn't enough processing in state. So we used to take whole carcass, send it all the way to the continent to be. It was a mess. We didn't have enough, and I didn't have enough money to build my own processing facility. So it also took us several years, and you guys will hear this, I'm sure, with a whole bunch of people you talk to. Product quality is the number one thing. It's what will dictate the vast majority of your growth. And it took us a long time to finally be able to come back to have everything processed on Maui, which means we had total control of that supply chain and that quality. And that was really the big inflection point for us. When we had full control over the quality of our product, we started growing really, really quickly. Because up to that point, it was A, convincing somebody to even try it. B, the quality of our product and the consistency was all over the place, depending on how somebody temped it down and if they cut it frozen versus temp. It was, and I didn't have any control. It was sitting in a plant on the continent that I had, I was just getting pictures. So struggled for 3 to 4 years to build really good systems to create quality product. Which was another really fun problem to solve, but ultimately resulted in us building those systems here. And you might kind of tell I'm sitting in a shipping container right now. This is my office. Yeah. We've built our entire operation out of shipping containers.
That's awesome.
Because they're mobile, and more importantly, they're modular. So when we finally were okay, we're going to do our own processing, we brought in one shipping container, retrofitted it, and we were able to do just a little bit of processing. And then when we could, when we had enough to do the next one, we dropped another shipping container beside it, cut a door in it, and then we had a 2-container processing facility. And now it's one of my favorite things is we'll bring in visitors. You guys got to come here one day. Yeah. And you stare at the outside of this there's 9 containers that are stacked together. And it is this it's completely unassuming, what is in here? And then you open the door and it's just this world-class processing facility sitting behind this container door that we got to build modularly. So like a lot of things, we had to scale appropriately for growth and cash, and when we could we did have to raise money along the way to take these different jumps. But the other big, product quality, number one thing ultimately as a growth driver. 2, we got really lucky in the investment group that we did have, i.e. the Tim Ferrisses and Peter Attias, and that voice for us drove the vast majority of customer acquisition early on, and still really does. But we got really lucky to be able to jump into podcast land early on. And of course we did the base Meta, Google, et cetera, but podcast drove the vast majority of growth for a long time.
That all makes sense. And as you're painting the picture with these modular shipping containers, I could not help but get Jurassic Park vibes. I'm pretty sure there's a few, 1 or 2 of the movies, there's helicopters flying shipping containers over islands, stacking stuff up. And it's also state-of-the-art facilities where they're doing dinosaur research and stuff. You're also using infrared tech. And I'm pretty sure there's a scene with an infrared goat in Jurassic Park. Not that I'm a huge Jurassic Park fan by any stretch of the imagination, but I keep coming back to these images.
I try and take a drink of water, and my guy throws a Jurassic Park reference at me, and I just spit on myself live on the air. I love that.
My goal every time, I want to get Anthony to spill some food somehow. That's the goal every episode. So, you mentioned podcast land earlier, super fortuitous timing, right? And talk to us a little bit about how that business has scaled and how you're thinking about that business moving forward. Because like you mentioned, you have a herd number you're trying to aim for. You're trying to find that balance, right? And that's both from the rancher's perspective and the data that you have. And, most companies okay, go out, find more cattle. But you have a finite number in that herd. So what does that mean for your business moving forward? And how has that changed the way you think about growth?
Yeah. So we went big on subscription early on. obviously so much benefit to LTV. Once a customer like on meeting venison instead of beef, like there's very limited options elsewhere. It's highly convenient. We can get it right to their door in 2 or 3 days. So like big win like on subscriptions. In the next 2 to 3 months, the number of subscribers and or members will match the number of deer required every year to balance populations. And at that point, you close membership subscription indefinitely. Now, it's not really closed because you have churn, right? But we actually have true scarcity. And this is my job as CEO to make sure we're telling this really well, because leveraging true scarcity is what dictates growth for us. Because that guy churns at an old pricing from 2020. The next person that coming in is not getting that pricing. They're like, my job is to continue to leverage our value proposition to make sure we see continual growth for our customers, and like just as importantly for community and the level of support that we have. The mobile invasive species harvesting systems we've designed absolutely can go other places. So there's 2 other islands with other deer. Like there's scale potential for like other islands, other places. This actually doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, which is really interesting. And those are conversations we're having. But what more importantly, I remember going through like our first fundraising round and having to create like my operating agreement, and that initial investment group just like dragging me over the coals. Like, well, what happens if you die? And I'm just like, what are you guys talking about? But I want that operating agreement puts community first, and it puts scale like last, essentially. We wanted to solve a very specific problem. So part of this is, because everybody's going to run into this, is we also set an expectation very, very early on that this is where we're going. The operating agreement dictates that you're coming for the ride or not. And they're along for the ride. And they understand how big we're going to be on Maui. And it's a substantial business to do 15,000 deer a year. And it'll produce, like it's a dividend model. But if that's as big as we get, that's as big as we get. Solving that problem is the most important thing for Maui. And we are laser focused on that for now. And then we'll kind of see what happens after that. But
you keep mentioning, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but like, if you're lucky enough to have a subscription, you're lucky enough. Like the last time this happened, we did not do it well. So Peter didn't tell us, but Peter Attia went on Rogan's podcast, talked about us. Rogan brought up the website. He absolutely crushed us. And we were sold out. We were sold out of everything for 7 months. And luckily we had already started a process with our customer where we restock every month. So at the beginning of the month, we put everything back in stock, because this is more commercial fishing boat than ranch operation. Like if it's like harvesting can be all over the place depending on what the month is, but our customers were furious. Like regular customers that could get it all the time were like losing their minds. We had people writing in like, this is the venison Hunger Games. I hate this. Like people were just like, they were not happy. So we've done a better job planning. Like we've been telling customers for months and months and months, like it's coming. Please be ready. Please don't be like, when it is inaccessible, we just want to, and why we're not scaling irresponsibly, we want people to understand why. And so with that, to answer your question, like we're trying to do a good job of that and communicating that. And I think most of our customers are getting it, which is great.
I'm curious, do you have enough demand, and is there any interest, or is this already happening with like the local community on Maui? Are there like high-end restaurants serving Maui Nui venison, or is it primarily like all DTC, all packaged, all being sold online?
No, definitely lots of really cool relationships with really nice restaurants. There's like a pizza truck that uses it. We preferentially allocate inventory locally, both from a wholesale level, but also D2C. So I have no problem talking about this. Like somebody that pays $40 a pound for this pays $8 a pound for this locally through our Kamaina program, through like our local accessibility program. They get the exact same thing. It gets delivered to their door in the same way. we've been unapologetic about that from day one. Like, this is a community resource, and we not only make sure it's accessible from a purchasing standpoint, but we have a Holowai program, which is a donation program we established in like during COVID. We're also, as one of the most isolated landmasses on the planet, when like shipping, it takes us 2.5 days and we're out of food in the entire state.
Wow.
So shipping lanes, anything like COVID, all shelves were empty. And then unfortunately recently, 9 months ago, we had one of the worst wildfires in recorded history, and immediately the community like needed to call on this resource. And so we've developed programs for our community over the years so that like this is accessible and they're able to pick it up from different locations. So we do, I think we've done like 90,000 pounds in the last 8 months here. So it's something that like we still very much believe it's a community resource. We want to make sure it's accessible from a purchasing standpoint, but also like from a sharing standpoint with the community.
That's incredible. And I don't want to take any thunder away from the wildfire support, because I know that's been super near and dear to your heart. And I'm sure, the communities appreciates that work to a capacity I can't understand. But I do want to touch on, for our retail listeners, the ordering piece is crazy. I've been lucky enough to go to Maui, to Hawaii, and check out a couple of Whole Foods stores there, right? And like Whole Foods typically, like in most retailers, you order, Monday for Tuesday, and the order arrives the next day. But the grocery buyers in these stores are ordering 10 days out, and like, so a shelf can be empty and they're like still ordering for what they think is going to happen 10 days in the future. It is so complicated. So that food scarcity thing it's legit. And it's amazing that you have prioritized feeding the local community the way that you have. And that pricing thing is different. I mean, that's almost incentive for me just to move to Maui so I can eat Maui Nui at that price,
We got word of I don't know what to call it, like a venison vacation. We got word the other day of somebody flew in, came to one of the stores locally that you can get it for super cheap, bought like 50 pounds of it, put it in the suitcase in the store. And apparently like the guy asked it, he's like, he went right back to the airport.
That's incredible.
And I was like, that can't be true. I think somebody like flew in, like bought it locally, and then like just went right back on the plane. And I was like, is that going to happen? Kind of crazy. But again, like lots of companies, De Beers, all of these people can have like false scarcity. I think when you have true scarcity, it's something that we are going to do our best to try and leverage for community and customer, and utilize that pricing power to make sure we can continue to grow and serve. There's like 40 people sitting out here between our harvesters and butchers. Like those types of local jobs are amazing, and we want to pay them really well. And this is my favorite part of like the regen conversation, is those are local, hyper local young people taking care of place. That's what regenerative ag is. Like they are vested in taking care of this place, and it's like long-term health. And that's an amazing thing to grow here locally, is seeing that local community committed to environmental improvement, right?
Yeah, especially when the legacy of American agriculture is basically just extracting from rural economies to move money into urban centers. Jake, I'm curious, kind of like if you can share what the customer feedback and demographics have shown as to the primary purchasing drivers, because there's super cool story here. It's super unique. There is scarcity. The nutrient density is crazy. Like there's all these reasons that someone can purchase from you, which mirrors all the regenerative brands. But I think we're all still struggling as a movement of like, what do we attach ourselves to? Is it all of those things? Is it nutrient density is kind of the silver bullet? Is it something different for each consumer? So just curious, kind of like what you can share that y'all have learned from that journey that might be applicable to others.
Yeah, so couple sub segments for us. Certainly not like a single cohort that's really valuable. Cohort number one is, and you got to remember, we're so much more expensive than the vast majority of other cohort number one is, I was brave enough to purchase it once, and it tasted amazing. Like there is shock. It is 100% taste why they're repurchasing, i.e., 100% product quality. And I actually really think the same way and this is my favorite, we can get into nutrient density. This is my favorite conversation around nutrient density is just like really good coffee, your brain teaches you like it's good for you. And you want like, I think our customers always comment on like, oh, it's so clean tasting. And like they are tasting the harvesting process and they are tasting nutrient density. And because there's no fillers and none of like, that's the cohort. Like I finally got over the edge and product quality won me over. So I think that's not, taste is the most important thing, which is crazy because that took me years to learn. Because I thought it was ethical, I thought it was story, I thought it was all these things. Like I advise a few other like small brands and they send me their stuff and I'm like, that tastes terrible. I don't care how like I'm just like, I don't care how good this is for you. I don't care how good your story is. Like I've learned this lesson. You need to make that thing taste better. And so that's like big step number one is taste. Step number two for us, which is a really interesting cohort, is vegans. So, and this
crazy,
and this, but this will fall into it, which I'm sure you guys have heard before within the meat industry, i.e., ethical, humane. I think where we bring some vegans back is we're so simple to understand. So the animal has to be harvested, i.e. the alternative for the animal is worse, right? And then the nutrient density is so compelling that they're like, if they were on the edge, they were like, I'm going to try it. And classic, they start with broth. I don't know why. So they try the broth. Maybe it's less. I'm not sure what that is. They try the stick and then they're like, they're done. They don't eat. Like we honestly still get an email a week from a customer or like a referral from like, I thought I was never going to eat meat again. I haven't done it for 20 years. I'm so, and the gratitude that they share is they're so happy to have found something they feel okay with. Right.
Wow.
And so that's like, if I could take them out and like stick an LTV on them, like they're forever, right? As long as we keep doing our job to produce like a quality product. And then the last one via, certainly not like last in order, and maybe forcibly, Peter Attia, Tim Ferriss, Andrew Huberman, who are they talking to? Right. They're talking to the health and wellness. And when we got our nutrient density data back that put us just so heads and tails above everything else, i.e. even just protein per calorie, even just the conversation of you can get 10, 11 grams of protein in 50 calories, that single conversation was, anybody that's counting macros or anything else is like, I can't get that anywhere else. So if I could answer the question, if you're not looking for several cohorts, especially with how hard it is to find people these days via Google, like if you're not actively searching out several sub-segments to your customer base, like, you are going to have a hard time. So we don't ever have like a single customer. We've got like 5 or 6 customers we're constantly like serving and speaking to.
Yeah. That all makes a lot of sense. I can say I've recently been counting my macros and I love the meat sticks. I should also say that my Fitness Pal has it wrong and I have to manually enter it in because maybe they're using an old
come on, my Fitness Pal. It's bullshit.
Come on. I've reported it needs to be changed. It's not accurate. So I'm working with you, Jake. We'll get that fixed sooner rather than later.
Appreciate that.
For sure. You mentioned broth. So I didn't know how we were going to bring this up, but you opened the door, so I'm going to walk through it. Jake and I, we had a conversation a couple of months ago at this point, and our teams have been working diligently on a collaboration, both from a packaging perspective and an R&D perspective to see like, hey, can we make a kettle and fire bone broth with Maui Nui wild harvested venison bones? And that will be coming next year. I can't say specifically when, but sometime in 2025, that is actually going to come to fruition. I just saw the first packaging mock-ups and they look absolutely insane. I can't wait for this to be released. So we're super, super stoked.
So us too.
Jake, yeah, when and why did that become an idea of yours? We're super fortunate and lucky and stoked for this partnership, but like, help us understand like why was that important to Maui Nui to develop a relationship like this?
So we're lucky enough that we could probably sell the vast majority of it ourselves. But when there's nothing to sell, you're either gonna like hide in a hole and your website's just gonna say sold out, or you're gonna tell stories. And I think probably what I was most excited about is Kettle and Fire has always tried to tell food system stories. And in having to like get to know you and Justin, like you guys are gonna keep telling that food system story, and that's the same story we're telling, right? So we want to find unique mission partners that we can work with for a long, long time. This is not like a single collab that like we want to tell food system stories together and how nutrient density can change that. And we're only so big, like we can't do that by ourselves. So can a relationship with Kettle and Fire create more collective good? Hell yeah. And admittedly, like had your broth before I made my own. Did you taste the first sample? I think it was awesome.
I haven't had it yet. No, I did see the nutrition facts panel, which I'm not allowed to talk about, but it was incredible. Jake, to your point, like nutrient density is really important to us, and I'm trying really hard not to say what I want to say, but the nutrition on this SKU is going to be through the roof. And to your point, like this isn't a super commercially viable SKU for Kettle and Fire, but it's a story and a system that we want to support. You know, we can't have national distribution omni-channel for this SKU. There's just simply not enough bone supply. But we want to support the work that you're doing. And if we can get that into more people's hands and tell that story and get more people to understand the importance of nutrient density and wild harvest and how meat can be a positive impact on the planet, like we want to collab and do that work with you. So we're super pumped up about this, man. I cannot wait to try the samples. I got to get on my R&D team and tell them, like, why has this not been shipped to me yet? First and foremost. And number two, to launch this thing next year is going to be super fun.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun telling that story as the inputs for the story change over the next 4 to 5 years. Like in 4 years, we're going to be having this conversation like, oh, the first nutrient density is being approved and like going on labels and like, can people understand it? So we get to keep having this conversation on a larger platform because we can collaborate together. You're going to have it one way or the other, but we might as well do it together. And Kettle and Fire, and we have a few more of these that like, I think those are just exceptional relationships to help build better food systems. And yeah, we're honored and super stoked to be able to do that with you guys.
Oh yeah. I'm grinning ear to ear the whole time because Jake and I get on an intro call months ago and we're just, going back and forth. And he's like, well, I feel like, we could do more with broth and maybe through the collaboration. And I'm like, yeah, I host a podcast with a guy from Kettle and Fire, right? Yeah. So that was the easiest intro I've ever made.
So fun, man. Yeah.
So Jake, obviously we're super pumped. That is a SKU that is going to come in the future. And I'm actually really upset that I haven't tried it yet. So I'm going to slack my team right after this. But,
it's coming, brother.
I need to get on this ASAP. But what else is coming for the future of Maui Nui? Is it more products? Is it more partnerships? Can you talk about any of the other strategic partnerships that you have on the horizon? What's next?
Sure. So let's do this. So I can talk about one that we're producing, a product that we've never made before. We are crazily jumping into the supplement industry. So we are going to be producing a organ capsule. So
hell yeah.
We saw the nutrient density info and we're just like, I ate heart and some liver and I was like, oh, I have to find a way to eat more of these things. And so we dug into like liver recipes and I was like, I just can't make this work. And so selfishly, and I love it, like cleanest liver I've ever tasted. So selfishly, we're doing three things. One, we are producing a 90-10 stick. So 10%, so 5% heart and liver. That is more multivitamin than meat stick. And I don't know what happened, but it is probably the best tasting stick we've ever made. So that's coming, which is really fun. And like the macros and micros on it are pretty crazy.
Amazing.
2, making an organ capsule, which same thing, like the nutrient density on it is amazing. And all of the synergies that come with like eating freeze-dried or like consuming freeze-dried organ is just so good for you. But 3, the one I'm really excited about, and I've been taking for about a month now, we're doing velvet capsules. So antler velvet.
Yeah.
So antler velvet is currently illegal in most of the sports arenas because it has IGF-1 in it. It has human growth hormone. So remember, a deer antler is one of the only bones in the natural world that regrow. This thing, like 30 inches of it, regrow in. So it's the real deal. I've been testing it for a month. Same thing, like there's going to be limited supply, but we are just trying to do our best, to obviously serve customer, but really utilize every single part of this animal as best we can that is most valuable to our customer. So those are 3 really interesting products that'll be coming out. We've got like a breakfast sausage coming out next month, which is amazing. We have a really cool partnership with, can't say who it is, but a pet food company that's going to be producing one of the best pet products on the market with some of our offal.
Awesome.
And then have 2 really cool big partnerships with some giant brands, can't quite talk about yet, to support Whole Eye. So directly fund the long-term support for our community. There's 2 giant brands that are jumping in like all the way in to really support like the long-term recovery of Maui and making sure our community always has venison available for that. So those will be big ones, man. We're really excited about that as well too. So yeah, lots of new things coming, which is great. So
that's incredible. And I love the concept of taking an ancestral blend ground pound and putting it into a meat stick. I think that's such a low hanging fruit to have like organ meat accessible on the go in a very convenient format. Like that is incredible. So I'm personally super pumped, and I think it's got a lot of commercial viability. So kudos to you. Also, for anybody who's listening and not watching, Jake looks wide. He looks good. He looks strong. So that supplement must be like really doing his thing. And I was trying to figure out like how do I word that in a way that doesn't feel like I'm hitting on you. But
perfect.
Like,
there you go.
I gotta try this stuff, man. So pumped for that. That's gonna be really good.
We'll give you guys. We'll let you in early on those subscriptions if you want, brother. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure.
If you ever needed motivation to get your first Maui Nui order or be on their email list for some of these upcoming products, this podcast will get you over the edge.
Actually, this podcast has been. We're all going to get in trouble because, well, you got approval for the broth, but I definitely didn't get approval to talk to you. So, but yeah, lots of fun things this year for sure.
Yeah. Well, Jake, it's been a really fun conversation. It feels like a shame to wrap it, but I know we need to. Unfortunately, we'll do conversation 2 live from Maui, so I'm looking forward to that. But before we do, I'll ask you the question we kind of wrap all the episodes with, which is how do we get Regen brands to have 50% market share by 2050? How do we get there? Product
quality. It's got to taste good. Like it has to.
I love how simple that was.
Yes,
and you're spot on.
It has to, and when you think it tastes good enough, you have to go back and try and make it taste better. And for that is a function. I love it because it's nutrition of place. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, how good it tastes comes down to how well you take care of your places, and then like obsessing over product quality. It has to taste good, and it'll get us there for sure.
I love the lesson there for brands because if there's anyone that could obsess over everything but product quality, it's Maui Nui, and that's your answer. And so it just shows like the fundamentals are the fundamentals, but all this extra work that we're doing in regenerative and better food systems is going to end up being that, but we just have to focus on that. So I love it, man.
Yeah,
really cool.
We're going to get there. Cool.
Well, we're probably going to drive more traffic than Peter and T and Joe Rogan. For sure. So this is the part of the episode where I give the website a shout out. So it's Maui Nui, that's NUI, venison.com. check it out. There's some incredible long format storytelling. I think there was like a YouTube video on there, and I originally was like, oh, I'll watch the first minute, and it was 10 minutes long, and I was enthralled. It was so fascinating to see, and it's beautifully shot. Your imaging and branding is on point. So anybody who's interested in learning more, please check out the site. Buy what you can, because it is legitimately scarce. And yeah, Jake, thank you so much for the time, man. Kettle and Fire Cruise coming out in October, a handful of us, so can't wait to meet in person, see how the process works, and again, appreciate everything you're doing, man. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Really appreciate the conversation you guys have. It's super important. Yeah, let's definitely do this one again on Maui.
Appreciate you, brother. Thanks for joining us.
Take care.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our Regen recaps on the website. Regen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Regen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the Regen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.